All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Documenting the Dearly Departed, Records for Family History Research. My name is Josh Goodman. I am the archives historian here at the State Archives of Florida here in Tallahassee. We have got a packed house today on this webinar, which I'm delighted to see. I'm glad so many of you could be with us today. So since we do have some new faces I see on the list here, I just want to say a quick little bit about who we are, where we're located, and about the institution itself. The State Archives is located in the R.A. Gray building at 500 South Bruno Street in Tallahassee, Florida. We are open just like any other public library from Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. The only time that's not true is on a state holiday. We are also open some Saturdays. We are open at least one Saturday a month. So if you're from a little bit farther away and can't quite get to us, check out archivesflorida.com. and it'll let you know what Saturdays we're going to be open. We also have extended hours sometimes for different things, like we're celebrating American Archives Month this month. So, of course, we're going to have a couple of late research hours this month. Okay, there's a common misconception about archives that you must need to have some kind of special permission to use the resources in the archive, or that you need to have an appointment, or you need to be prepared to talk about what your next book is going to be about, or something like that. That is not true at all. Archives, at least in our public state archives here, function very similar to a public library. The materials are there for you to use. They are a public facility. They're taxpayer funded. They are yours to use. We're just kind of here to make sure that they're in good shape and ready for you to use. So please do take advantage of that. Pop in anytime. We even have free parking. So please do feel free to make use of things. This is just a quick look at our public research facilities. You can see lots of different kinds of folks. We get students, genealogists, family historians, community historians, and the odd historian working on books. So lots of different folks. But let's talk about our subject for today. We are talking about how to document death and burial. Now, death, as dark as a subject as it can be in thinking about the here and now, when it comes to genealogy, it is absolutely essential that we be able to document both death and burial of our ancestors for a couple of reasons. Not only does it give you those vital statistics that you're looking for in being able to build out your family tree, but death can also help explain the behavior of the ancestors who lived. It can help you explain why somebody moves. It can help you explain why a household is suddenly divided. It can help you explain why, why a bunch of property gets split up between different people, or why court cases come up and different things. And so being able to put your hands on an accurate understanding of when, where, and how someone passes away can really help you take your family tree to the next level and verify that you've got the right stuff. Another thing that's important about having a good solid death date is if you've got those ancestors, and we all have them, somebody named, something like John Smith or something along those lines, being able to know, really firm birth and death dates on somebody is going to help you tell all the John Smiths of the world apart from one another. Because that can, I've got a case of those very things in my family tree with a guy named Perryman Moody. And he named his son Perryman Moody. He had a cousin named Perryman Moody. And without several of those Perrymans having gravestones or any death records whatsoever, it's kind of hard to know, which one is the right one when you're looking at them. So I say all of that to say this is certainly something important to work on, and why we want to cover that today. There are some difficulties in documenting death, even though it's so important. Death certificates are not universally required until the 20th century here in Florida, and that's the case in a lot of states around the United States. That's not to say that death was not being recorded. Rather, the records that were produced to report death were different from town to town, county to county, and very haphazardly kept. Some counties just didn't keep anything. They figured if somebody needed to know that you were dead, they would look in the church records or on gravestones, and that was enough. Other places, particularly larger cities, they tended to be a little better at keeping records regarding death, especially if there was a municipal cemetery where they needed to have a record of who all had been buried in the cemetery and where they were located, so that they didn't attempt to use the same plot twice. that sort of thing. Another challenge that comes into play is that lots of folks were buried without gravestones. Prior to the very late 19th century, here in Florida at least, there weren't a whole lot of stone carvers. You had to order a stone monument for your loved one if they passed away from somewhere up north, or some place where there was a marble quarry or somebody who did these things. If you were in the interior, you'd have to order one of these stones from Jacksonville or Tampa or Pensacola or something like that. And so a lot of times people's graves go for a number of years without having any stone at all, and some people just never get a gravestone. In other cases, somebody gets a grave marker, but it's made out of wood, and so after a couple of decades, it rots down completely, and you just don't have one. So there's that. Another problem is that death records sometimes conflict. For example, death certificates, they're generally pretty solid, but, birth and death dates, when those are being given, death dates, of course, the doctor is going to be able to explain at what time, somebody actually passes away. But the birth dates that go onto a death certificate, especially in the early days of their existence, when people were born in the 19th century, when birth certificates are not really a thing yet, those can be quite inaccurate. Family members putting gravestones on graves 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the person dies. Sometimes they're sitting around at a family reunion being like, when did this guy die? And they just don't know. Or sometimes they put something down wrong. So there's all kinds of things that can sort of go wrong with documenting death. And that's why we want to show you today all of the different kinds of things that you can use, all the different tools you can put in your toolbox to get at this information. So what we'll focus on today, we'll start off with a couple of helpful hints for research, no matter what kind of death and burial research you're doing. And then we're going to look at a wide variety of different kinds of records that you can use to triangulate the actual death date of an ancestor, where they are buried, and how they came to their final to their demise. So that's sort of the layout for today. So let's start off with some helpful hints. First of all, and this is the most important one, and this is why we're including such a variety of records today, and that is to be creative in searching for death records. If you're searching for somebody who passed away in the 20th century, particularly after about 1920, when death certificates are really uniformly in use across the state, yeah, your death certificate is going to be the first sort of go-to document. But when you start digging back into the 1800s and prior to that, the chances of you finding a death certificate for your ancestor decreased dramatically. And so, the question that we often get here at the archives is, okay, well, if there's no death certificate, what is the system for recording death? And that's where the bad news comes in. There's not really a system of recording death that is uniform across the state or anywhere, really, prior to the death certificate being required by law. That law is first passed required in the 1890s for the state, but it doesn't even really go into, it takes a while to get that into full effect. It's not really until the 1920s that you can reliably look for a death certificate on every single person who passes away in Florida. And even then, stuff gets through the cracks. So prior to that, there is no real system. What you have to do is think about all of the possible ways that death can get recorded. And the way that I advise folks to do this is to think about death as a process. Death certificates deal with the moment of death. But if you think about how death works in many cases, there's a whole process. You've got the things that contribute to someone passing away. Sometimes it happens very suddenly, but in many cases, people actually experience an illness where they've had to go to a doctor and they've had to purchase medicine, and they may have had to move into their, if it's an elderly person, they've had to move into their child's home or something like that. So you've got documentation of that. Okay, there's the act of actually dying. A doctor actually attending the person who's in their final illness, in their final days of life. If they spent time in a hospital or in some kind of institution. And then after death, you've got the records that are produced through newspapers in terms of obituaries and cards of thanks and things like that. You've also got all of the work that has to be done to memorialize someone who's passed away. The paperwork associated with a funeral, with embalming, with the purchase of a coffin, and of course, finally with purchasing a monument or making some kind of monument to put over someone's grave. All of those parts of the process of death and dying produce paperwork. And so if you're having trouble locating a death date, for someone, and there's no death certificate available, there's no gravestone available, then you just want to think about all those different parts of the process. Think about the kinds of records that are produced by those events along the timeline of death, and then think about where those records would be kept if they have survived. And so that's what we're going to do a lot of today. A couple other hints to keep in mind as we go through. Even official record keepers make mistakes. We all love that phrase, are we really setting this in stone? And so a lot of people say, well, if you've got a gravestone, that is the end-all be-all of death dates. But as for a reason I've already mentioned here, there is no guarantee that a gravestone is produced at the time of someone's death. Sometimes it can be multiple generations after a death, and there's no guarantee that the person who, even though they're paying somebody a lot of money to put this stone together, there's no guarantee that they have the exact right date. The other problem is that oftentimes it'll just have a year. So there's more to be done than just to find a single instance of a death date for an individual. Numbers get transposed in things. 1923 becomes 1932 and stuff like that. So how do you deal with this? Is it really a hopeless situation in trying to get this information? And the answer is no, but the way you can guard yourself and you can protect your family tree from having inaccurate information in it. And of course, this is increasingly important, and I see a lot about this on the forums on Ancestry and Family Search and things like this. People share family trees now, and so you want to make sure if you're putting information out there that you've got really well-researched stuff and that you've triangulated between several different sources to get the best possible information. So definitely the way to do this is to use multiple sources of information whenever possible to document death. If you come up against two sources that disagree, and there's a wild disagreement, consider the fact that you may have a generational issue. You may have two different Paul Smiths. You may have two different individuals there. So those are sort of my three basic hints. But let's go ahead and dig into the actual kinds of records that we can use. Now, I know I just got finished bashing death certificates as the end-all be-all, but we do need to at least talk a little bit about what they do, what they don't do, and how you get them. We get that question a lot. A lot of people call into the state archives asking for the death certificate of so-and-so. And while it's true that we sometimes will have records that relate to the death of an individual, death certificates actually don't come from the state archives. They come from the Florida Department of Health. So let's talk just a little bit about how death certificates are structured, how the information is structured, and how they've been kept over the years. So I mentioned to you that in the 1890s, that's when death certificates were first mandated by the state. And that's because Florida established its State Board of Health in 1889. It did that in response to a pretty massive rash of yellow fever outbreaks in the late 1880s. As communication and transportation got better and people are moving around the state in greater numbers, it became a lot easier for diseases to be transmitted. And so the State Board of Health was established in order to kind of counteract that and get some public health measures into place in communities all across the state. And a number of cities, even before that, had been requiring some kind of death certificate or some kind of record. Maybe the sexton of the city cemetery would record cause of death and the name of the attending physician on their records showing who had actually been buried in the cemetery. Sometimes you actually had death certificates being created. But it was quite some time before the folks on the State Board of Health were able to actually get death certificates sort of synchronized all across the state. So what we have here on the left is kind of a proto-death certificate. This one comes from 1906. This one is for This one is for the city of Fernandina Beach. Well, at that time they were just calling it Fernandina. And you can see it's got the basic information that you would expect a death certificate to have: name and age, some basic demographic data, some information about what this person actually died from, who had actually attended the individual. And so if you're looking at death certificates from this time period, officially each Board of Health in each county was supposed to turn in copies of these death certificates to the State Board of Health, which later became the Florida Department of Health after a few morphs there. But that didn't always happen. So if you contact the Florida Department of Health and you're looking for a death certificate for a particular individual and you don't find it, in some cases that's because that county at the time of that ancestor's death was not in compliance and no death certificate was ever created. In other cases, it could be because the death certificate was never transferred from the local government up to the Florida Department of Health. Now again, after about 1920, that's not so much the case. Things are pretty much humming along at that point. But prior to 1920, you will occasionally run into cases where a death certificate exists at the local level, but not at the state level. These death certificates, for example, that we're looking at, these were actually discovered in the back of a vault in the city of Fernandina Beach. They were doing some reshuffling of records in there, and they found these and determined that that people did not know that these existed. And so they partnered with the state archives to get these up on floridamemory.com. You can actually search these on floridamemory.com. You can find them under the collections section. Nowadays, however, this over here on the right is what death certificates look like. Now, or this is rather what one would look like if you were to order it. You'll notice on here that the paper that this death certificate is printed on has this nice barcode on it. It's got this very modern looking safety paper that's being used. However, if you look very carefully, the actual death certificate itself is a little crooked on the page, and the writing is actually in handwriting. And the reason for that is that this is actually a microfilm image of a death certificate that was photocopied onto this safety paper. So it is the official death certificate of this individual from Holmes County here. But what the Department of Health has done is they've gone back in their records and they have put it onto this, because even though it's a historical record, they are still making an official statement by providing this record to you. So how do you get these? How do you get this stuff? So let's take a look at how to get into these records. So if you want to get a record from the Florida Department of Health, a death certificate, what I would advise you to do is actually do Florida Department of Health death certificate, and just Google that, because I like advising folks to do that rather than giving you the exact URL in a lot of cases, because sometimes the URLs can be quite long. But if you'll Google that, you'll get right here at the top of the search results, death certificates, Florida Department of Health. Now here's a funny little thing. I actually learned this myself. We tend to think of death certificates as being a very private, personal kind of record that you wouldn't want just anybody being able to get your hands on. But there's actually some pretty strict public record laws dealing with these. If a death certificate is older than 50 years, so if it's been more than 50 years since someone has died, certain personal identifying information may be redacted from it, but pretty much anybody can get their hands on a death certificate from back before that time period. And that's what we're seeing here on the screen, is actually the exact rules relating to who can get a death certificate and what kind. So if you've got a death that you're looking for that happened prior to 50 years ago, you're going to be able to get pretty much the entire death certificate. If it's a death certificate that's more recent than 50 years ago, you can still get the death certificate without being a direct relative of the deceased. It's just that a lot more information, things like cause of death and address and stuff like that, is going to be redacted from it. Okay? Now, down here towards the bottom of the page, you'll see where they've got the DH727, application for a death record. You fill this in. It's a nice fillable PDF that you can then print out. You put in as much information as you know about the person. You can, and it tells you again the information about who can get what information and the 50-year moving wall on getting the full death certificate. You send this in with, I think it's $5 now. That amount may have changed. They've got some information on here on how much they'll charge you. But you send that into the Florida Department of Health, and they will send back the records that they have. If there's no records, they'll tell you. And you may be able to follow up with them and get more information to them to help them locate the information you're looking for. But it's just that simple. So let's get back into the PowerPoint. All right, so death certificates, that's the easiest thing. Second easiest thing and the most obvious source of information would be gravestones. These are great, of course. We've already talked about some shortcomings of gravestones. Remember that gravestones are not always made at the moment that someone passes away. Sometimes they are generations more recent than the actual death. So beware of that. Always triangulate the information that you get on a gravestone with some other source, at least one other source, just to verify that you're looking at the correct person. I mean, you know, sometimes people leave off junior and senior and the third and all these other ordinals and things. Sometimes people leave that off of gravestones. This is particularly true if a family member moves to another community where they were never known as junior. Or maybe their kid is actually the junior and they're the senior. So because of all that, you've just got to be very careful to verify what you get on a gravestone. But let's look at some helpful documents that go with gravestones and go with cemeteries that can be helpful. Now, some folks have probably used Find a Grave before. We love Find a Grave. Any genealogists out there in the crowd, I know you guys have probably spent some time digging around on findagrave.com. It is an amazing resource, but I want to offer one little bit of caution here. The problem with, well, I wouldn't say a problem, but it's something to keep in mind with Find a Grave. If you haven't used Find a Grave before, the information that goes onto this website is entirely volunteer-based. These folks, you know, they might have a couple of paid people running the site itself, but the people who actually come up with the data for the gravestones that are recorded in Find a Grave, it's put in by volunteers. And oftentimes those volunteers are working just off of what they've seen on the gravestone. And what that means is that all of these entries on Find a Grave are prone to the exact same problems that the gravestone itself is prone to. So that means that if, you know, this person's information, if this gravestone here for James Peterson, who was born and died, you know, in August 1908, if that stone was put up by family members 30 years down the line and they're off by a decade or off by, you know, a few days or something, then that information, that incorrect information has been repeated in this record. So, you know, Find a Grave is great. It's a great reference source. It can help you sort of get out of a bind. But just like the case with the gravestones themselves, verify what you find in Find a Grave. Okay, so before there was Find a Grave and other websites like it, there were cemetery surveys. Okay, and what these are books, also generally done by volunteers, where people would go around, people who were interested in genealogy and helping other people do genealogy. They would go around to cemeteries and mark down all of the burials that they encountered in those cemeteries, or sometimes they would transcribe church records or whatever records they could find referring to the individuals buried in a cemetery. And you might be thinking, well, Find a Grave kind of takes care of this already, right? Isn't Find a Grave just an electronic version of this? Yes and no. While it is true that you're oftentimes going to find the exact same information in one of these printed cemetery surveys that you would in Find a Grave, here's the thing. Between the time that a lot of these cemetery surveys were made and the time that Find a Grave was produced, some of those stones could have been destroyed. They could have been moved. You know, sometimes the people who wrote these cemetery surveys had access to private cemeteries that the Find a Grave volunteers just haven't been able to get access to. You know, this is just another very useful data point that if you're not finding what you need in Find a Grave, sometimes it's because something has happened to those graves, or the Find a Grave volunteers just haven't been able to get in there to do the work. So this is another tool in your tool belt. So where do you get cemetery surveys? The challenge with using cemetery surveys is that they tend to be self-published. This isn't the kind of thing that HarperCollins is going to pick up and publish 5,000 copies of. This is the kind of thing that your local historical society or your local genealogical society is going to publish maybe a couple hundred copies of. So typically, these are going to, the copies of this are going to be centered around the community where the cemetery is. The local public library might have them, the local historical society, the local clerk of court maybe. If there's a municipal entity or a county entity that is in charge of maintaining a cemetery, they might keep a copy of this sort of thing. And so those are the kinds of places you want to look. Now, for those of you doing Florida projects and researching Florida lines, the State Library and Archives of Florida maintain a pretty extensive genealogy collection on, and you can get to that. You can get to the the catalog records for those books online. How to find out if we actually have one of those? If you go to the state library's online catalog at library.florida.gov, it's already popped up in the screen right there. I'm going to go to that, and it's going to take you to the state library's thing. And if you click on this menu here at the beginning where it says everything, and go down to genealogy collection, and you can. These are cataloged by what county, what town, all kinds of the names of the cemeteries. There's lots of different ways that you can search for these. Let's say, for example, that I was interested in looking to see if there was a cemetery survey for a cemetery in Taylor County, Florida. I might just type in Taylor County Cemetery, or I could do cemeteries or something like this. Okay, now in this case, I didn't get what I was looking for. I've got one for Chatham County, Georgia. I've got Taylor and Mantown cemeteries, Baker County, Florida. That's not what I wanted. I know there's got to be at least one cemetery survey for Taylor County, Florida. So what if I were to just back out and just put the word Taylor in there and see what I get? Taylor family history, cache writings of Taylor County, Florida. Not quite getting what I wanted still. Oh, look what I got here on number 12. Survey of Taylor County, Florida cemeteries. See how it's cemeteries instead of cemetery? That's what tripped me up. So it's a good moral of the story. No matter what kind of research you're doing, if you don't get what you wanted on the first try, that doesn't mean that the archive or the library doesn't have what you're looking for. You may just need to change up your search terms a little bit. And so I can actually go in here and see exactly what kind of information we have about this book. And that's going to help me get what I want. All right, jumping back into our PowerPoint. Here is another useful tool. This is one that's not quite as well known and not quite as obvious. If you are looking for veterans and you're looking for the graves of veterans, the WPA back in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, one of the many projects that they came up with to put people back to work was a grave registration project for veterans. So what they did was they sent people around to every county in the state of Florida, and they looked at gravestones. They had families show them where veterans were buried, and they put together all this information about all the veterans of every war up through World War I. And they put together these alphabetical lists of veterans buried in every county, and then all this information about where exactly they were buried. And they also put information in there about their wartime service. This is an example page from one of those reports that you're seeing on the screen right now. Okay, and so what's great about this is, remember what I said earlier about gravestones not always still being there. Sometimes they get destroyed. Sometimes a tree falls over and hits it, or some vandal takes it or breaks up a stone into 1,000 pieces. Also, you have the problem of people having wooden gravestones or no gravestone at all. And so if you're looking for somebody who happens to be a veteran in your family tree, these WPA grave registration records can be absolutely fantastic. So how do you get your hands on these? You can either use this direct URL that I have right down here. UF Digital Collections has digitized all of these, but I'm going to show you another way that you can get to these if you don't, for whatever reason, you happen to be looking for these and you don't have that URL handy. Okay, UF, that's the University of Florida. If you look up UF Digital Collections, and we go into UF Digital Collections, and this is their main search engine. If you type in WPA grave registration and just search for that, bam, the first thing that pops up is the master catalog record for all 9 volumes of that, because it's a pretty, as you can imagine, every veteran in the state going all the way back to the American Revolution, that's a lot of graves. And so when you go into one of these, you can see that they've kind of broken it up by district. For example, we've got just Hillsborough and Polk in this volume. You know, this one's got Citrus, Hernando Lake, all that sort of thing. You can go into any one of these, and as you flip through the pages, it's going to show you, it's going to say a little bit about the program. That's this here. And then it's actually going to show you all the way that they split the state up into different districts. So you'll know what volume you need based on this map here. And then as you keep flipping on through, it'll start taking you into information about the cemeteries. They've got the abbreviations in here so that you'll know what each thing means, like all those places where you saw C on that previous thing I was showing you in the PowerPoint. That's referring to veterans from the Civil War, Confederate. And then you go right into the alphabetical lists of cemeteries and then veterans. Very handy. It's in alphabetical order. All right. Jumping back into the PowerPoint. Another kind of record that you can oftentimes get your hands on is the records of municipal cemeteries. Lots of larger towns and even smaller towns have public burial grounds where people did not have to pay any particular amount of money to be buried there. And the reason for that is that's kind of a public health thing. For a long time, cities did not want people burying their dead just anywhere. They wanted them in one spot where they could control exactly how those individuals were buried, where they were buried, and that sort of thing. And so you get these public burial grounds. Later on down the line, they start charging money for the lots for someone to be buried, but for a long time, that's not the case. And the nice thing about that is that it centralizes the record keeping on death in communities. This, for example, is a page out of the sextant's records for Boscobello Cemetery over in Fernandina. This is part of that same set of records I was telling you about earlier, where they partnered with the state archives to get these digitized. I should mention, by the way, as a little bit of a public service announcement, if your community is, you've got some records like this and you guys are looking for a way to get these digitized, we would love to partner with you to make that happen, because these are some of the most interesting records we have on this, and this can really help genealogists out a lot, as you guys surely know. But anyway, as you look in the records here, what this was is anytime they would bury somebody in the cemetery, they would write down this basic information so that they knew who was in the cemetery, and this also sort of doubled as a death record. So we've even got cause of death, date of death, medical attendant, and all of that in here. It's a great bit of information. And, the way to get at these, they can be in different places. We have the burial records for certain city cemeteries here at the state archives. Sometimes the state library here will have a transcript of those. You can search for that in the genealogy collection on the state library's catalog, as we just did looking for those cemetery registers. You can also, in some cases, go back to the communities themselves. For example, I know the city of Tallahassee here, they have a pretty extensive, they've got those records dealing with where people are buried in Old City Cemetery here in Tallahassee. I know that the city of Perry, where I'm from, they have those records at the city, at City Hall. Sometimes local public libraries will have those records. It just depends on the community themselves where those records have finally found a home. Another kind of, now we get into a couple of kinds of records for if you've got an individual who was institutionalized towards the end of their life, either in a state prison, a state hospital, a state insane asylum. something like that. Because those records, because public money is expended to maintain those individuals and those facilities, the record keeping on them tends to be pretty tight because money is involved there. So, for example, if you've got an individual in your family tree who you know is incarcerated for some amount of time, and you suspect that that person might have actually died in prison, or you're curious to know if they died in prison, or if they escaped, or if their term was completed, or something like that, we actually have the records here at the State Archives to uncover that information. And as long as the record is 50 years old or older, we can serve that record to you as a public record. There's no restriction on it as long as it's 50 years old or older. So, for example, this is the State Prison Register. This is Series S500 here at the State Archives of Florida. And so you can see here that they're giving you information about each individual prisoner. It'll tell you where they were sentenced from. It'll tell you the date that they were taken in. There's some basic demographic data about their age and their race and their sex, where they were born. If they left the prison either because of death or parole or a pardon or something like that, that information is included in here. And since we're talking about death, I have an example pulled right here for an individual who did happen to actually die in prison. This is Harry V. Moore, who came into the state prison, it looks like, in 1948. That's when he was originally sentenced. And then he finally they have it under the released column, but that's because he actually died in prison. He died in 1951. And it says right here that he died at Rayford. So if you had been looking for Mr. Moore and you just hadn't been able to find him anywhere else, but you had a suspicion that because of something earlier in his life that he might have ended up in prison, this would help bring some closure to the case to determine that he did in fact die in 1951 while he was at the state prison. We also have records from the Florida State Hospital over at Chattahoochee. I was giving a presentation a few weeks ago, and someone was trying to track down a relative who had somewhat unusually relocated, kind of up and moved to Gadsden County. And she didn't really have an explanation for that because the woman that she was tracing, the rest of her family remained down in Wakulla County. And she said, I don't get it. I've never found any records of a divorce. And it turned out, after a little bit of extra research, that the family, the man and wife had not gotten divorced. It's just that she had been admitted to the Florida State Hospital, which at that time was functioning in part as the state insane asylum. And so there's three basic kinds of records that you can get from, well, three basic kinds of records that you can get involving folks admitted to the state hospital. And the first one of the three is the one I have up here on the screen. And this is the commitment record. In order for someone to be committed to the state insane asylum or later the Florida State Hospital, you have to be declared insane by a judge. And the way that worked, at least for many years, the way that would work is, you have some folks who fear for someone's personal safety. They fear that they are not mentally capable of taking care of themselves, and they go to a judge and say, "Judge, we think that this person is insane." And they do this through an official petition. The judge appoints a committee and charges that committee with actually examining that person and determining whether they are in fact insane. That committee reports back to the judge with their report. If the person is not insane, then they go to a variety of other potential remedies to handle whatever's going on in that person's life. But if the committee agrees that the person is insane, then the judge issues an order to the sheriff saying, "Hey, sheriff, you are hereby ordered to go and get this person and put them in the state hospital or some other qualified mental health institution." That's the general process. It's changed a little bit over the years, but that's the main process of how that works. And the good news for us as genealogists is that if you have a relative who experienced that process produces a lot of paperwork, starting with the commitment paperwork that has all of these petitions and writs and these notices to the sheriff and things like that. And we have those records here at the State Archives. They are located in Series S1062. Now, normally I would show you how to find these on the Archives Online Catalog. The Archives Online Catalog is down right now, so I'm not going to be able to show you how exactly to get into that. I can at least show you how to get to the website with the understanding that right now, as of October 23rd, 2019, we're having some issues with it, so give us a little bit to get that back online. But I will at least show you how to get to the Archives Catalog. And that's going to be at archivescatalog.info.florida.gov. And it'll at least get us to the front page, but I think the search will fail. But what we'll do is we'll at least go this far. If you're wanting to search for records in Series S-1062, that's the commitment records from the Florida State Hospital, you would search at the series collection level for S space 1062. Put it in quotation marks so that the search engine knows you want that exact phrase. Now, it should tell me that there's nothing here, no such thing here. Oh my goodness, it's actually working today. Look at that. Well, that means I get to actually show you how to navigate this collection. Excellent. Okay, so when I click on, and just going back here, when I click on this number right here in my search results, it's going to take me to the catalog record there in those search results. This will tell you a little bit of information about these records. It'll tell you about the restrictions that we have on these records. Again, like so many things, it's got to be at least 50 years old for us to serve this information. If I want to search for individuals, I can click on this little yellow folder icon right here. Okay, and you can see that we have individual records here for each individual human being who is committed to the Florida State Hospital. Now, it's only going to let you look at 30 records at a time here unless we trick the server. So let me show you a little trick. If you go up here in the address bar and you see where it says record max equals 30, that's actually an instruction to the server saying this is how many results I want you to show on each page. If you'll actually back that out, you can put up to 999 in here, and it will actually display whatever number you tell it to put in there, 999. And it won't do 1,000, and it won't do more than 1,000. But you can put in that 999, and that way you get to search for more people. Because as you can see, there's a lot of these. I've scrolled and scrolled and scrolled, and I'm only through the B's. You can also use your browser's find function. Usually it's going to be Control F for Windows-based computers. You can see how that's triggered the find box down here in Mozilla Firefox. That's also how it works for Internet Explorer and for Google Chrome. If you're working on a Mac, it's going to be the Command button and F. Okay, and if I wanted to look for a particular person in here, let's say that I was looking for an ancestor with the last name Brown. Well, I have to spell Brown first before that'll work. Look at there. It's going to show me every individual with the last name Brown. We've got O.J. Ashbury Brown. We got Moses Brown, James Brown, John Brown, Eliza Brown, whatever Brown you're looking for. Okay. And so even you'll notice that this page is only going to take us through the B's. You just keep going next page until you get to the area in that alphabetical list where you need to be to search for the relative you're looking for. Jumping back into the records here. All right, another kind of record that we have is the medical records that existed for that individual during the time that they were at the Florida State Hospital. Being medical records, these also are pretty heavily restricted. But if you contact the State Archives Reference Desk and ask about a particular record, you can find out what parts of this are available. There may be some redactions, but you would use the same process to find this, except these are going to be Series S-1063 rather than S-1062. Oops, went to the wrong thing. There we go. And so again, going to archivescatalog.info.florida.gov. That would get you here. Same song and dance, open quote, S space 1063, close quote. I'm searching at the series collection level, and boom, there it goes. And you get to see a little bit of information about this, and you go into each one. You click on that little folder icon there, and it's going to take you into the alphabetical list of medical records. One thing that it's important, I didn't point this out with the commitment records, clicking on any one of these is not going to actually take you to the record. It's going to take you to a listing. But once you have this information, this series number, series S1063, you've got a box number, you've got a folder number and everything, that's going to give you the information that you would need to give to the State Archives reference desk to request a copy of this record. They can scan it in for you. They can, oops. Sorry, when I said Siri, my phone thought I was talking to it. Anyway, so there we go. So that's how you would request one of those records from the State Archives reference desk. Okay, there is a third kind of record that may be of some value to you, and these are the burial records. When an individual died at the Florida State Hospital, they would be returned, the remains would be repatriated to their families for burial in their family plots, if possible. There were a number of individuals at the state hospital who did not have family members that would claim the remains. And in those cases, they would be buried at the Florida State Hospital. The monuments that were put over their graves do not actually have their names on them. They're numbered. However, there are records that you can use to determine whether somebody was buried in that cemetery. We have those records here at the State Archives. They are in series S2661. Unlike record series 1062 and 1063 that we were just looking at, the catalog records on the State Archives online catalog will not go name by name by name because this is table data. So instead, what you would do if you wanted to know if an individual is in these records, these burial records, you would contact the State Archives reference desk and say, hey, I know that I have an individual who was at the Florida State Hospital. I think there's a chance that they were buried there. Could you look in series S2661 to see if they are listed anywhere? You would give the first and last name of that person, and it's very important to note whether they were African American or white, or whether they were male or female. And the reason for that is that if you look on these records, see here where it says CM, WW, WM, CM, that sort of thing. What these are referring to is whether this was a white woman, a white man, a colored woman, because that's how the plots were arranged. They actually had the plots, the burial plots at the state hospital segregated by sex and race. And so that's going to be very important because at a later point in these records, they actually have the lists separated out as well. So that's going to help the reference desk answer your question a lot faster if you'll give them that information. Church cemetery records, very similar to the city cemetery records that we've looked at. Many churches have graveyards, as you know, and oftentimes they do have records that list who was buried and when, and whether they've been a member of the church, and whether they had relatives in the church and this and that. Sometimes in the case of these records from St. John's Episcopal here in Tallahassee, they actually have where in a family plot each person was buried. Now, I should mention that the ones that I have on the screen here are pretty awesome as church cemetery records go. Sometimes you get nothing more than a list, and there's not even a row and grave number or anything like that. So be prepared for records of any sort. It could be a map with numbers, and then the numbers, there's a key to the numbers. Sometimes you'll get a book like this that's nice and pre-printed. Sometimes it's just going to be a bunch of records written in the back of a list of baptisms and marriages and stuff. You just don't know what you're going to get. It varies. Where you're going to get these records varies from case to case. Sometimes we have them here at the State Archives, or sometimes we'll have a transcript of those records in the State Library here in the genealogy collection. You can use that same trick that I showed you earlier to look through the State Library's genealogy collection to see if we have those records here. You can also look through the Archives online catalog to see if we have records from a particular church. But you also might want to look at that church itself. If the church still exists, ask that church if they still have those records. One thing that may help you to know if the records ever existed, okay? Let's see. If you go to floridamemory.com, Florida Memory is, of course, the official online outreach tool of the State Archives. Anytime we digitize records, we put them here in Florida Memory. If you go to Collections on Florida Memory and you scroll down, to on the collections page here to WPA church records. These are a little bit of a misnomer because when the WPA went through Florida and did their collection of records here, they weren't actually collecting the records of churches themselves. They did collect some interesting basic information about when churches were founded, who their original pastors were, that sort of thing. But what they did here that's really valuable is they actually took down information about what records had been retained by the churches and who was in possession of those records at the time that the WPA survey was being conducted. So, for example, if I was to, I'm just going to pick a group here at random. I'm going to do Hardy County. I'm going to look for all the churches that existed in Hardy County. And what I'm getting here is the dates of establishment. So let's look at Chester Grove Baptist Church and see what we get. Okay, this is what these records that the WPA put together on each church that they encountered. This is basically what they look like. Basic information about where it's located, when the church is constituted, where services were held originally, if they weren't held in the location where the church was holding services now, information about the first pastor. Here's what you want. Here's what you want. Okay, church records. Clerk's record, the National Baptist Church record, roll and minute book, ledger, Sunday school minute roll and record book, yada, yada, yada. What you're getting here is a list of all the different kinds of things that the church recorded, and you're getting who actually kept the stuff. This is going to help you know what to ask for when you go to the church. And you can see here, for example, that that Chester Grove Baptist Church was recording deaths as of the time that this book was being kept. And so you could actually go to that church and ask, does this specific record exist? Do you know who might have it if you don't? That sort of thing. So just a handy little trick. All right. Jumping into the PowerPoint again here. Oh, and I had a slide for that. Look at that. The Social Security Death Index. This is a pretty cool tool that is available through Ancestry. You can, sometimes your state archives or your state library will have a book listing for this as well. But Ancestry is the easiest way to get your hands on the Social Security Death Index. You know, whenever somebody passes away and you apply for the Social Security death benefit for the deceased, you know, or even when you just report that death to the Social Security Bureau, then, you know, that Social Security card that had been possessed by the person who just died, it has to be canceled. That Social Security number is canceled. And so the Social Security Administration keeps a record of all of that, and that means that they have some really interesting data that they put all there together. They have the date that the Social Security card was issued. They'll have the last address where that person had lived. They'll have the death date because, you know, that information has to be there in order for them to put this information into their records. And it's just a nice, concise thing that you can get your hands on to get a pretty solid death date. And these are pretty reliable. They're not 100% reliable, but they're pretty reliable. Now, we here at the State Library and Archives, we offer free access to Ancestry Library Edition here at the State Library and Archives. You may have a library close to you that does this. Many of you are genealogists who have your own Ancestry accounts, and that's great. But yeah, if you go to the birth, marriage, and death section of Ancestry here, you'll see that the U.S. Social Security Death Index is one of the most popular things that people use, and you can just get right in there. I'm going to use my grandfather who passed away a few years ago. I'm going to actually use him as an example here. If I were to put in, let's see, we'll put in James Moody, and he died in Taylor County, Florida. Let's put that in there. All right. Yep, there we go. Died in 2010. And I can get all the information that's in that index. You won't actually get the image of the Social Security Death Index itself, but you will get at least this information. And that gives you a pretty good solid death date. And bonus, you get a solid birth date as well. So we love the Social Security Death Index. Newspapers. You know, with newspapers, the big thing to remember here, I think everybody's pretty familiar with how obituaries work, but again, think about death as a process, not as an event. Remember that before, after people die, oftentimes there'll be a card of thanks of some sort saying, thank you for bringing over all this wonderful food. Thank you for the flowers. Thank you for the memorial donations, whatever. So that is another opportunity that you might have. Something else that people sometimes forget, especially in smaller communities, newspapers tended to report on every little thing that was happening. There were these sections called the personals. And by that, I don't mean somebody was looking for a date. The personal section of small community newspapers in the 19th and early to mid 20th centuries would actually comment on the movement of individuals and families. If somebody went to go visit their relatives in the next county over, they might say something like, Mr. and Mrs. Jones and their 2 children motored over to Live Oak for the week so that they could visit Mrs. Jones's, parents or something like that. Even things so simple and mundane as that would end up in the records. And so sometimes, because the personal section is so granular as that, sometimes you can actually catch someone getting ill and being on their way to death. So, for example, we have right here Mrs. Fortner has been quite sick, but is much improved and will soon be out again. J. Allen, somewhat indisposed, but we hope to see him out again soon. Sometimes this can be sort of what we might call whistling past the graveyard, where somebody is really, really ill, and the newspaper doesn't want to be so blunt as to say, y'all, so-and-so is getting pretty sick. Y'all need to go see him if you haven't seen him yet, because he's on his way out. But they put these nice sort of very happy, cheerful, upbeat sounding messages to let folks know, hey, somebody's kind of sick. And sometimes this can be the beginning of the process of death for somebody, and they may help you nail down at least a month or a time period when somebody's starting to go downhill. Sometimes these can also give you a cause of death when no other document exists to give you a cause of death. Mortician's records. I do want to be mindful of our time here, so I'm going to run through these kind of quickly. But suffice it to say that because the State Board of Health had trouble getting doctors to actually make out birth and death certificates, they kind of hedged their bets and got coffin salesmen and funeral homes to send in information about death as well, so that they could get the best possible information about mortality in the state. And so. And this is still the case that coffin dealers and funeral homes, they are regulated, and they do have to record the business that they do. That information is generally kept by the Department of Health, but in some cases, the private copies of those records of mortuaries and funeral homes are sometimes retained by the funeral homes themselves. And for the ones that have been turned into us here at the State Archives, which is very hit or miss, it depends on whether that funeral home has voluntarily given us their records, or if those records ended up in a private manuscript collection or something. We will occasionally have those records here. And that's one of those where you just have to ask. You just have to ask the State Archives Reference Desk or run a search on the Archives Online Catalog for the name of a particular undertaker to see if we have their records here. But you can see that it's essentially the same kinds of information that you would get in a cemetery record, even all the way down to date of death, cause of death, sometimes attending physician. But here you get the purchaser of a coffin. So interesting bit there. The last thing I want to do with our last minute here, and that is to talk about what do you do if there is just no record whatsoever of an ancestor's death. How can you at least get close? There are 3 kinds of records that you can use to at least get close to an ancestor's death that can help you. Number 1 is the census. This one's fairly obvious. If an ancestor shows up with man, wife, kids, the household is intact in a particular decade, but then you go 10 years later, the household is still intact, it's still in the same place, but one family member is missing, particularly a spouse, that oftentimes is going to tell you that a death has occurred in the preceding decade between those 2 census records. But how can you get even closer? You need some kind of public record that records people every single year. Good solution to that is tax rolls. because people get taxed every single year. The census only happens every 10 years. So, for example, I've got my buddy here, Levi Hickson. Here he is in 1856 paying taxes in Alachua County. By the way, we have the tax rolls here for the early to mid 19th century for Florida here at the State Archives. You can find out which ones we have exactly by looking in the Archives online catalog in Series S28. The later ones after the late 19th century tend to be retained. Those tax rolls tend to be retained by the county courthouses, either by the property appraiser or the tax collector. So that's where you can find the later ones. But here we've got Levi Hickson. He's being taxed in 1856 on records. But then we go to the next year, 1857. Look here. Levi Hickson deceased, D-E-C, E-P-H as agent. His brother, E.P. Hickson, is being listed as the agent for Hickson's estate. So Hickson is still paying taxes even after death. So that's, it's goes against the old saying that the only thing that stops you from paying taxes is dying. That's not exactly true. But anyway, so we can actually see here that Hickson must have died either in 1857 after the taxes were assessed, or at some time prior to taxes being assessed for 1857 because of this document here. So there is one other kind of document that you can use to get even closer to death, and that is will and probate records. Will and probate records, these are a great document source. I'm sure there's a lot of you guys who use these. When somebody passes away, if they have a will, that's great. It's usually been recorded at the county courthouse, and so you can find these that way. Ancestry provides access to a lot of these will and probate records. But there's another kind of record beyond just wills that's really valuable for determining death dates, and that's because a lot of people die without having wills. That's called dying intestate. And when that happens, the heirs, the would-be heirs of somebody, they have to go to a probate court judge and say, all right, so-and-so has passed away. We need to figure out how to divide up his estate. And so what happens in those cases is the judge will appoint somebody to go in and inventory that person's property. And then the judge will figure out what, the heirs and any creditors, they can make claims against that estate. And then the judge will oversee the distribution of the estate to the heirs and the creditors and all those individuals. Those records are kept in the probate records at each individual county courthouse. However, we do have microfilm copies here at the State Archives of a lot of those probate records. You can also get a lot of those on ancestry.com. If you just look into they've got a set of records strictly dealing with wills and probates and that sort of thing. They've got it nice and simple where you can divide it up by county. Great stuff. All right, I have jabbered a lot, and I do apologize. I went just a moment or two over time, but do we have any questions?
Thank you, Josh. And as we stated at the beginning, you can either raise your hand by clicking the hand raise button and we'll get you unmuted, or you can type your questions or comments into the chat panel. Gwen, I've got you unmuted. Go ahead. We don't hear you. Do you have a microphone, or are you on the phone line? No, you might need to type into the chat panel, Gwen. We're not hearing you. Anybody else have anything they want to type in? Okay, looks like we do have one. Misha says, city directories are also a great resource. A man and wife live somewhere 1 year, and then the next year it records them as single or her as a widow.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Gwen says, what year can you search for SS death date?
For Social Security death date, that's a good question. 1935 is the earliest that series goes. So 1935 is the first time that death index is created. That's because Social Security doesn't exist until the 1930s. So that particular resource will take you back to 1935.
I've also noticed that the Social Security number is not visible. What has happened?
Social Security numbers will be visible for some records and not others. I don't know exactly why that's the case. I don't know if that's because the number has been recycled, or what the case is. But you may have noticed that in the example that I pulled with my grandfather in there, his Social Security showed up just fine. But then the one that I had for the one that I showed in the PowerPoint, it did not have it. But it was also a much older entry. My guess, and this is just a guess, is that that number had been recycled, and so they didn't want that name and that number associated in the record.
Karen, I've got you unmuted. Go ahead. And
Hi. I was just wondering how close this is to other states. Is this strictly Florida, or can this be pretty much applied to other states?
That is an excellent question. And while it's true that a number of the records that we've talked about today, we've used Florida examples, and we've talked about we've talked about how to get these things from the State Archives and the State Library of Florida. But I also hope that these will give you ideas about the kinds of records you can request. For example, the tax rolls. I've got up here Series S28, State Archives of Florida. That's how you would go about getting Florida tax rolls. But taxes are certainly something that happen in every state. And so you can certainly ask the state archives or a county courthouse in another state, how are tax payments recorded? Do those records still survive for the 19th century? What exactly do I need to do to get my hands on those? Same thing is true for will and probate records. Those tend to be available from from courthouses all across the United States, and from state to state, you may they may be recorded slightly different ways, and estates may be administrated with slightly different protocols, but the kinds of documents will generally be the same from state to state.
Great.
Go ahead.
Great, thanks.
Absolutely.
anybody else have any other questions? And we've got another question. I'm searching for a death record between the years 1915 and 1919. And can I use anywhere as the place of death?
Follow-up question to that, place of death. Which database are you referring to for searching for this information?
Florida Department of Health.
Oh, for Florida Department of Health. What I would advise that you do in that case, give them a call. See what they would prefer for you to do in that case. If it says in there in the instructions that you can leave place of death blank, I'd follow those instructions to the letter. I have not yet tried one where I did not know the place of death. They may prefer for you to just write that in there as just anywhere, or they may prefer that you go through some other process to get that information down. I would contact the Florida Department of Health directly just to find out. And you certainly want to do that, because if you're going to pay $5 for it, you want to make sure that they're actually going to fulfill your request. You want to do everything possible to give them everything that they have. They may be able to tell you some more specific things that you can do to make it easier for them to fulfill that request.
And she says, my relative could have died in Sumter or Pasco County according to the census records.
I see. Again, I'm going to defer to the Department of Health on this, just because they're the ones who are going to process that paperwork, and I wouldn't want to give you advice that if it was me and you were replying directly to us, I'd say, well, put both in there and just tell us it could be either one. But I don't want to tell you to do that and then them reject the application. So do get in touch with the department directly, and that way your proposal won't get rejected.
Thank you, Josh. Anybody else have any other questions for Josh? Is there any other upcoming trainings?
We are always looking for new topics to do on these. We've done quite a few. If you have not subscribed to the Bureau of Library Development's YouTube channel, and again, that's the Florida Bureau of Library Development, we actually have a playlist on there called Genealogy, and we've done all kinds of stuff on researching land documents relating to family history, business records relating to family history, just a multitude of different kinds of records that are very similar to this training we've done today, and we're going to think of more to do in the future.
And one suggestion, how about doing one for Hispanic search, especially in Cuba?
Wow, now that's one that we have not done yet and something we should look at. I know we've had a request to do one on researching Native American ancestry, and I think that one's in the works as well. So the short answer to your question is yes, we will be doing more of these, and it looks like somebody just gave us a great idea for another one.
Yeah, and if you guys have ideas, I mean, we welcome them. That we want to give you guys what's helpful to you. So if you have ideas, please let us know. And I will be sending out a follow-up email after this webinar ends, and it will include the link to this recording and the playlist with all of the other recordings. And please share it. You know, it's all free. Obviously, it's YouTube. So we would love for you guys to send that to anyone that you think might enjoy it or find it helpful. Paulette, I've unmuted you. Go ahead. Paulette, we can hear you. Did you have a question?
Oh, could you please repeat that YouTube link?
Oh, I'm going to send it out in the follow-up email.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. We're going to stay on for a few more minutes and make sure we get any questions answered. Does anybody else have any others that you can think of for Josh? Go ahead, Gwen. We've got you unmuted. Or you can type into chat. What about adoption records?
Adoption records. Now that is one that I have not looked into quite enough on this. That's not something that we have here at the State Archives. But I tell you what, I know that the State Archives Reference Desk gets this question quite a bit. You'll actually see their contact information right there on the screen. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think that those may also come from the Florida Department of Health. I'm not 100%. They may come from Department of Children and Families, something along those lines. Anyway, the State Archives Reference Desk, give them a call and ask them that question. They may refer you to the state library, but one of those two folks, they get this question quite a bit, and they can tell you who to get in touch with.
And another question, let's see here. How to access tax rolls and how far back can we go, or how recent can we access? Is there an identity theft aspect to the information? An identity theft.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So as far as tax rolls are concerned, that's actually there's on the identity theft thing, no, just because the kind of personal information that is attached to tax records. First of all, the ones that we have here at the State Archives don't go up past probably the 1870s or something like that. So that those identities have long since sort of ceased to exist. But even in modern tax records, the kind of information that is attached to those is there's not much to it. You get a name, a street address, I think sometimes, or the address of the property itself, and that's pretty much it. And that you can generally get from going to the property appraiser's website of any county. That's all public record. But you were asking about, what tax rolls are available here at the archives. I will show you, since the Archives Online Catalog is behaving today. If I go to the Archives Online Catalog, and again, open quote, S/28, that's the series number, series S28, and I'm searching at the series collection level. If I click search, it's going to take me right here to tax rolls, and you can see the years that we have them, 1829 to 1898. Now, having said that, that does not mean that every tax roll for every county is going to be here. A lot of them have gone missing over the years before they came to us here at the State Archives. But if I click on this, and then I click on the yellow folder icon, okay, I'll actually get a list here of all the ones that we do have. I'm going to do my little trick right here, and I'm going to make this 930 instead of just 30. Now I get a list of all the different tax rolls that we have available. And you can see that they're kind of concentrated in the mid-19th century. Those are the ones we have available. And the ones after this are generally going to be at your county courthouse.
Do you have Miami-Dade County?
Let's see what we have for Dade County on tax rolls. Yes, these are the ones. I'm highlighting them right now. Those are the ones that we have for Dade County. And again, the later tax rolls are going to have been maintained by the county. The copies that we have here are the ones that were sent to the state comptroller's office so that the comptroller could compute the amount of tax revenue that they could expect to receive from the counties. That's why we have copies of those records. However, the records are created at the county level. So the ones we don't have, if they still exist, they'll be in the county courthouses. They live in different places depending on what county you search in. They could be in the office of the tax collector, the tax assessor, the county clerk, or the property appraiser.
So thank you guys for being on with us today. Like I said, we're going to stay on until we get all your questions answered. So does anybody else have any other questions before we leave for the day? And you're welcome. Everyone that said thank you, you are so welcome, and we're so glad that you were on with us today. And thank you to Josh for doing another fantastic webinar.
It is always a pleasure to share this information. Archives are for everybody. It's your collections. Please take advantage of them.